Trump has made it clear that if Putin doesn't play ball, as in at least consider negotiations as well, then he's going to upscale the support for Ukraine even more. So there's a lot of different game theories, strategies, ways that this could go. But I certainly think the Russians are going to continue to indiscriminately strike across Ukraine. They'll probably start using even more unpleasant methods of warfare in and around Kursk to try and deal with the Ukrainian forces there. There's about 50,000 Russian and North Korean troops, so they're definitely going to put pressure on them. But is it going to ultimately decide the outcome of the war in the next 2 months? No, I don't think so.
Welcome back, everyone. We have Pyotr Kurjan, a geopolitical strategist with a background in strategic studies. And nice to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for letting me join. I'm a big fan of the channel and all your guys' work, so it's pretty bizarre, pretty cool to be actually on the show.
Of course, and yeah, I've been watching your content for last few weeks now, and it's really excited to actually talk to you. And we can jump straight into it. The biggest news we have right now is President Biden has approved Ukraine to use the long-range missiles inside Russia. How would that change the war?
Yeah, so it's well, there's no playing it down, right, mate? This is huge developments, possibly one of the biggest potential escalations of the whole war. And certainly in the latter half of this year, since possibly Ukraine took Kursk. And that is arguably one of the main motivations for this eventual green lighting by Biden, which is that he sees the escalation of the Russians bringing in North Korea, right? This is no longer a singular cross-border conflict between Russia and Ukraine. It is direct participation of another nation state. Now, obviously, people on one side will argue, well, the Americans, the NATO alliance, have been supplying Ukraine anyway, so they are already involved. So what difference is this? Well, the difference is that this is, a group of troops from North Korea actively fighting on Russian soil and not just sort of the provisions of munitions and stuff. So in Biden's mind, some people think that he is, using this as an excuse to greenlight Ukraine to use these ATACMS, which are, the furthest long-range missiles that America is willing to provide, and also greenlights the Storm Shadows of the UK and the other missile assets from France. So this is a multi-tiered, multifaceted move. And, we could talk about whether or not that means anything particularly. But in my mind, I think it is Biden setting the way. I made a short about this on my channel just yesterday. And it makes it very clear that, in my mind, Biden wants to maximize the options that Ukraine can potentially have and utilize before Trump inevitably comes in and starts reducing that aid and forcing Ukraine to try to go to the negotiating table. So Biden's, hedging his bets like that.
Yeah, since I could guess Russia is probably looking forward to January 20th, Trump taking the White House. How will Russia react since that's only 2 months from now? Would they escalate the war even further because of this decision, or will they play down how much of an impact this has on the war?
Well, this is one of the key things, isn't it? And there's an urgency here because Russia says one thing, but then it can do another, and so can many different countries like that. But one of the biggest long-standing themes of this whole war, specifically since 2022, has been Putin's quote-unquote red lines, right? That Putin has said, if Ukraine does X, strikes into Russia at all, that is a red line that Moscow will not allow. The Kremlin will respond. Well, Ukraine hasn't only struck into Russia for more than 18 months at this point. If you remember the drones that struck the Kremlin in May of 2023, that was a big deal. Nothing came of it. And now we've got Ukraine occupying a significant proportion of Russian land. Now, you can argue that it's not strategically significant, it's not going to change the direction of the war. It's not. But the point is, this is optics. And Russia has said, this is going to happen if you do this. And it hasn't. So it's very difficult to tell whether or not Putin is going to follow through on some of the threats that he has made, some of the rhetoric that he's been raising, such as BRICS earlier on in October. I personally think that this is going to be a bit of a game changer, but the Kremlin might well try to have a bit what's known as strategic patience. The hope that they just, stay in the same situation and just wait for Trump to come in, and then he peels back that support. He puts pressure on Kiev by saying, look, you've got to go to the table, and if you don't, then I'm going to, make it even harder for you. And maybe the Putin regime can then be like, well, we didn't have to do anything because the new American president did it for us. The alternative to that is obviously that Trump has made it clear that if Putin doesn't play ball, as in at least consider negotiations as well, then he's going to upscale the support for Ukraine even more. So there's a lot of different game theories, strategies, ways that this could go. But I certainly think the Russians are going to continue to indiscriminately strike across Ukraine. They'll probably start using even more unpleasant methods of warfare in and around Kursk to try and deal with the Ukrainian forces there. But there's about 50,000 Russian and North Korean troops, so they're definitely going to put pressure on them. But is it going to ultimately decide the outcome of the war in the next 2 months? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, since you do bring up the strikes, actually, right before the decision that morning, Russia carried out one of the largest strikes against civilian and energy infrastructure. To me, just someone normal, it doesn't make sense why they are targeting energy and civilian infrastructure when they should be really focused on gaining as much ground on the front line as possible, because that would give them an advantage when it comes to the negotiation. So maybe if you could explain a little bit what kind of advantages Russia gets by targeting energy and civilian infrastructures.
Well, at the end of the day, you've got to think about this in a post-war scenario as much as in the here and now. What I mean by that is when I was part of the World Bank, and we went to Ukraine soon after the developments in the Kursk, in the counteroffensive in Kharkiv, where they reclaimed all that territory, if your viewers remember that. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because it was to get a sense of just how much it would cost to rebuild Ukraine. And this includes energy infrastructure, it includes civilian infrastructure, basic things like roads, bridges. The point is Ukraine is becoming super damaged by this, let alone the territories that are still under Russian control. But, the middle of Ukraine, maybe not so much the western Ukraine, but the middle of Ukraine is dilapidated. It's so badly damaged. It's going to take hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild this. And so the point of Russia is partially if they can just undermine basic things like energy provision, gas, or anything of that kind of nature, then it just makes it very hard for Ukraine to be adequately prepared to rebuild in any kind of post-war scenario. But equally, a simpler second reason is it's just a way to cause harm. The Russians undertake a very different approach to warfare than in the West. I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong, but it's very, very different. And they just target, they don't necessarily adhere to international law, right? Russians look at conflict as a glorification. It's a build on from what was known as the Soviet doctrine in the 1940s and Cold War, where if you die for your country, it's a matter of pride, it's a matter of honor. And so, the term into the meat grinder exists, right? You can argue again, people will say, well, the Ukrainians are doing that too. But in the sense of Russia's doing it in a foreign land, we're not necessarily with the same motivations in mind. Ukrainians are fighting to defend their homeland is the rhetoric versus the Russians, which are doing it for a war of conquest and sort of imperialistic tendencies. That's the way that Western analysts frame it. So Russia targets these because it ultimately just sort of undermines Ukraine. It doesn't necessarily completely destroy its ability to do that. But if you look at the difference with Ukraine, right, their emphasis, although it's going to be interesting to see whether they do this, they will use the ATACMS and HIMARS and other equipment, the Storm Shadow missiles, to strike strategic and military infrastructure in Russia. Right, that's their argument. If you give us the means, Biden and so on, NATO, to target anywhere within Russia that is being a core, an airfield, right? Some of the drones that are being flown into Ukraine, or the missiles that are coming over, they're from places like Rostov and other oblasts, which have a fair amount of military, equipment and that's where the main supply of these are coming from. So if the Ukrainians can incapacitate those, then it undermines Russia's ability to continue these indiscriminate firings. Again, this is obviously a lot of speculation. We don't know what Ukraine's going to do yet, but that's what I would say to your question.
Now, I know you've been breaking down the Trump peace plan in a lot more detail than I have seen any other YouTube do, and we'll get to that in just one second. But before that, I quickly wanted to talk about the news that we got this morning that someone cut the fiber communication cables between Finland and Germany. And now we know Russia is never going to be able to fight NATO. So they use these covert tactics to cause chaos and cause damages. Do you think this was Russia?
I think that's a whoa, that's a provocative question there. I think that well, let's take a step back and think about what's also been happening, right? And I'm going to be a slightly provocative in saying that Germany has a power vacuum now. They've got a snap election. All of Schulz is looking pretty well. He's always been rubbish, frankly, as a decisive leader with any degree of conviction. And so I think, could we argue that there's something going on here with the election? Is it a coincidence, maybe? But equally, it's difficult to tell because it reminds us of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and who blew that up, right? Russian aligned voices will say that it was NATO, it was America, or Ukraine itself. Swedish and Dutch analysis has shown that it probably was actually, but Western sides will say that's absolutely preposterous. It was Russia self-sabotaging so that it can have a false pretense by which to escalate the war in further. This one is different because it's a data center in the Nordic country of Finland, which is no longer intact, and it doesn't seem to have as much sort of strategic significance, right? It's not good for Finland or Germany in terms of communications, but is it going to ultimately sort of mean that the Europeans are at massive risk from further Russian interference or sort of disinformation or something? Not really. I think that this might be a problem that is outside of the war necessarily. Again, I'm sort of speculating somewhat, but it reminds me of an incident that occurred about a year ago when the anchor of a passing ship severed about 2 cables, I think, and a gas pipeline on the seabed of the Gulf of Finland. So I think this might be more just coincidental from external factors than necessarily sort of a Russian bunch of divers or something going in there and taking it out. It serves nothing to benefit Moscow, and it's not going to play into the longer term direction of the war. So yeah, this area is obviously highly, highly tense now because it's very close to Russia, its naval fleet, and obviously Finland and Sweden have just joined NATO. So there's a lot of attention on them wanting to militarize to defend against what they see as Russian aggression.
Now let's talk about the Trump peace plan. I know you have really good videos on it, so we'll link it in the card up above and in the description. Hopefully there's a playlist. We'll link the playlist too. But one possible peace plan we have seen is a possible DMZ and no NATO membership for Ukraine in 20 years. How likely is that's something that both countries agree to, or is it just like a first offer in the negotiation that will take place?
Yeah, so what I would say, it's a really good question. Yeah, I've basically been creating like a mini series, what I'm calling Trump's Foreign Focus, where we talk about Trump's foreign policy approaches to respective areas or issues. So the first one was obviously on Ukraine, and then the second one was on the Middle East. I'm going to do one on China, I suppose I should say, and economic policy and a few other things. But the peace plan is particularly interesting because I would say that there's 2 different things there, right? A DMZ is not necessarily mutually exclusive with Ukraine joining or not joining NATO. The desire of Ukraine to be in NATO has been a long-standing push for, well, over 10, 15 years, arguably, ever since 2008 and Georgia's war with Russia. The Ukrainians have wanted some kind of relationship with NATO, but Western partners and members have been reluctant to levy that, and that's why many people blame the current war because of the Europeans' ineptitude or sort of inaction, inertia over it. But the DMZ is basically, it's the best example is North Korea and South Korea along the Korean Peninsula. However, there's a big difference here. The Korean Peninsula DMZ is about 200, 300 kilometers, if I remember that. To implement that in Ukraine would be 1,800, if I remember the line of contact along, between Russia and Ukraine, right? It's 3-4 times, if not more, the size. So that means, well, sheer implementation and enforcement is going to be extremely difficult. Number 2, who does that? This would obviously have to be agreed with the Russians. And at no case does this look likely. Equally, it has to be agreed with the Ukrainians. And whilst I think both sides are, talking constantly about peace and talks, when push comes to shove, I think that's going to be a little bit hard to implement. Trump can make claims all he wants about, imposing some kind of peace deal within 24 or 48 hours, if that makes a difference. But it's not going to happen because firstly, basics in diplomacy is you have to get the people talking first. We haven't even started that, let alone getting a product, and as something as specific and as grand scale as a demilitarized zone. But it sounds good on paper because it has demilitarized, and so for people who aren't as following this as much as we are, it sounds good, and they're like, oh well, Trump's helped to turn us away from World War III. We're no longer in the precipice, and so it sounds good on paper to Trump. It plays to his fan base. He can sell it to them saying he's done something, but ultimately, as the Americans love to use this phrase, kick the can down the road. He can then forget about it. He's done enough. And if Putin starts messing around, then he can raise the support for Ukraine again, citing that, Russia backstabbed him or something, right? That plays into his narrative, into his rhetoric. So it's an interesting idea. I was one of the first people to sort of say, could this ever be possible? And was laughed out the room by other people who are now saying, oh, it's actually, it could happen. So, but again, the realities of the size of the war and the view of it from both sides, as well as just who's going to man it, right? What, the Americans are going to start putting troops on the border to manage the DMZ? I don't think so. That's going to work in Moscow. So what, the UN? Well, what, the Americans and the Russians are going to vote in favour, along with the Chinese, the Brits, and the French, to do this? I don't think so. And which countries are going to supply those peacekeepers? Because you obviously have countries that have to supply. So a lot of unknowns here. This is the reality of when Trump makes these statements. And Musk as well. Like, I get it. It's playing to fan base, and I obviously want the war to be finished. But the realities are, when you get to the intricate details, it's a lot more complicated. And as for the Ukrainian NATO membership, as I say, that's been pushed for years. It's not going to happen, at least for 20 years. That's not just Trump saying that. That's everybody. At least not saying it explicitly, but implying it implicitly, right? In the sense that Ukraine is... and again, this is not me sort of hating on Ukraine, but they're not ready. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the bureaucratic, baseline foundations. They don't have the reduction of political and legal corruption that exists. Every country has to go through what's known as a membership action plan, which can take years. Bosnia has been doing this for 10 years. They started it in 2006. So, it's the same with Moldova, right? It'd be great to have them in sometime. And it's the same with the EU. These are very, very delicate, complex political and economic systems. And you can't just bring in a country the size of Ukraine, who's disproportionately, poorer or at a different place in its economic development and political structure. It's just not going to work. So I'm not saying it can't happen, but it's not going to happen at any time soon. They might have a looser relationship, but no, definitely not. And that's not down to Trump. That's down to the system.
That makes sense. And yeah, for everyone else, there's a much more in-depth breakdown about all this, and we'll link it down below. So definitely go check it out. But just yesterday, we had Zelinsky go on some podcast or radio show where he was a lot more optimistic than many people might have expected about Trump taking the White House. And he said that Trump will make sure Ukraine wins in the negotiation. So, what would be let's say we get to the negotiation, what would be the ideal scenario for Ukraine, that it gets out of the negotiations?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really dramatic time that we're living through right now. And as I said in the video, in the immediate aftermath of Trump's win, it's not surprising that the first tweet or main thing that Zelinsky did after it became very clear that Trump was going to win is, we really treasure the US. He's brown nosing if you want, or everyone is playing, buttering him up, right? I can't think of that. I think that's the right expression, right? They're trying to play good face with Trump. It's like, I can't wait to hang out with you again. We're having a great time, bros, by the barbecue, right? Zelensky was very deliberate in who he targeted first and why. And obviously he's not going to be critical of Trump now. Even the UK's Foreign Secretary has had to step back and sort of say, no, I don't stand by the comments of criticising Trump anymore. So I think Zelensky is definitely trying to maximise what he can get from Trump. If you remember, people who watch this very closely, Trump ended up meeting Zelinsky because he felt he should. Initially, he couldn't be bothered, but he changed his perspective on that. So that shows you that I think Trump even believes that there is value in sort of, maybe not because he believes in the symbolism of it, I don't think he cares about that, but transactionality. This guy's a businessman, and if he can think that Ukraine is going to give enough to America to benefit it, then he might continue to support. I don't think Trump's going to pull out completely of NATO or defund NATO completely. These are all maximalist, silly scenarios. He's certainly going to reduce American presence, and I 100% agree with him and anyone who says European nations are lacking in their funding, their respective funding, right? Their free riding. That's absolutely the case. So I think the best scenario for Ukraine would simply to try to compliment Trump enough that he doesn't cut out all support. I think it's more about minimizing what they lose in that, if that makes sense. As I said, I don't think the likelihood of a peace deal is anywhere near at all. Trump will certainly try to reduce American funding, but I think if Ukraine can continue to exhibit usefulness to a Trump administration, maybe act as a go-between between Moscow and them or something. It's difficult to tell what Trump thinks of Putin these days, and I think that their relationship is going to be more important than Zelensky and Trump's, to be honest with you. If you look at whenever Putin says anything, it's directed to Washington. It's not directed to Kiev. He doesn't care about Kiev. He sees this as a war between the US and Russia. So I think Ukraine is simply going to have to continue to fight. They're going to continue to fight anyway, because it's what the Ukrainians have been doing for 2.5 years, despite the West being quite limited in their support. And even if America does cut itself, realistically, I find it very hard to see Ukraine reclaiming the territories that it's lost. It's about 20% of the current landmass. Crimea is definitely not happening. I think it would be the case of just trying to prevent further loss of territory. And ultimately, some people don't like this, but you could see a scenario where maybe the best that you cut your losses, you accept that territory of Ukraine is now lost to the Kremlin, and Ukraine simply heavily securitizes its new eastern border with support from Western nations. But a lot of that depends on the White House. And if the White House isn't willing to do that, then this allows Putin to remilitarize and to try again. But if he does that within a Trump administration, well, then Trump would come back even harder. So I think the best case scenario for Ukraine, very simply, is to try to prevent peace negotiations from really being pushed, and for Trump to sort of maybe draw down and accept that this isn't going to happen quickly, and that maybe he's better off continuing to support Ukraine in ways that he can sell to the American people, and ultimately that benefits Ukraine. If not, then they'll have to accept territories being lost and try and put on a brave face.
Now, another interesting twist we had in the peace negotiation talks was the Times report that talked about Ukrainian pursuing nuclear weapons in case if there's a peace being forced on them that they may not agree with. How likely is that? And I'm guessing that would also, if Ukraine does try something like that, it would also piss off or make unhappy some of its Western allies, not just Russia.
Oh yeah, no, this is obviously Ukraine has developed its first set of ballistic missiles, I think, back in September. This is a big deal because it's setting a new precedent. It's not just Ukraine, it's everywhere. It sets a new normal, a new precedent that we're no longer in non-proliferation, and the idea of us trying to reduce the amount of nukes is we're going backwards, right? China's proliferating, Iran is very close to a warhead. Look at what's happened with North Korea and all its nuclear warheads in the past few years, and this is causing the South Koreans, the Japanese to seriously consider whether or not they should have their own nukes as a deterrent, and Ukraine might feel that way. If your viewers are well known, the Budapest Memorandum is one of the biggest talking points because a lot of people feel it was the responsibility of the US and the UK as signatories to come to the defense of Ukraine against, a Russian situation like this, and they didn't. And so maybe Ukraine feels that they should just have their own. The difference was when they housed the nukes in the 1990s and Cold War was because they had the nuclear weapons, but they didn't have the ability to launch that one. That was obviously still within Moscow. So for them to have their autonomy of this kind would be very, it'd be huge. And I don't think Europeans, let alone the Trump White House, would allow it. I think that there would be, if the Ukrainians went off to try and develop their own nuclear war heads, you would see a dry up of almost all American funding potentially. And European nations would equally, I think, be very, very wary. Because at the end of the day, Europe has been facing a lot of internal disagreements because not every country is as hawkish, right, in terms of supporting Ukraine. The Baltic states, the British, are very different to Spain and Germany, which have been a little bit more lukewarm or just hesitant to get involved more. So I don't think that that would happen, to be honest with you. And if the Ukrainians try to do that, that would probably isolate them quite a lot.
Another big escalation in this war was the North Korean deployments on the Russian front lines near Kursk. How's that going? Because based on the news, it seems like it's basically the same strategy, meat wave strategy. But we did, so I think 2 days ago or yesterday, we saw more reports that North Korea may send up to 100,000 troops. I feel like that's a lot bigger escalation than whatever we have had so far, millions of shells and 10,000 troops.
Oh, it's my favorite thing about this, buddy, is I mean I even put this on my community tab on YouTube and my X account. That I've got friends on the ground in that area of Kursk, and they're saying that this is the first time North Korean men have been out of North Korea. So what does that mean? They have free access to the internet, and what's on the internet that a lot of North Koreans will not have been able to enjoy, right? I'll just say it, pornography. So they are gorging themselves on, shall we say, this sin or whatever, this pastime, to the point where they're actually just being shot down because they're not even paying attention because they're just so. But this obviously, jokes aside, plays into the broader craziness of this all, which is that Russia is reliant on the totalitarian pariah state that is North Korea, the Kingdom. And this is obviously not a hatred against North Koreans, but the country is, there's a reason why it's been taken the piss out of here on YouTube, or countless films have been made about it. And, North Korea is not seen as the epitome of human development, but they are supplying the Kremlin now, because it shows you just how far in Moscow has got with this war, but also how badly it's going for them. And, no one's saying that it's going well for the Ukrainians, but to deny that Russia is not struggling in a way that no one expected is just silly. And yeah, there is reports now that we've got about 50,000 troops combined of 10,000 North Koreans and Russians. It's not exactly clear how well they're integrating as sort of battalions or whatever as groups. But they seem to try to make sort of raids, as it were, sudden little bursts into Kursk to try and disrupt and gauge about how well the Ukrainians are defending. But it just doesn't seem to be going well at all. They get pushed back, and a couple of weeks ago it was being reported that the highest level of casualties for the Russians in the war since it began properly is about 1,500 a day. So the Russians are going to be relying even more on North Korean troops. But at the end of the day, the North Koreans who go, they will never be allowed back into North Korea. They're never going to be allowed to see their family again because they are seen as tainted. They have been cursed by the outside world. They've been allowed to consume Western propaganda and South Korean news and information. So it's difficult to tell really what the North Korean troops that do come over are thinking, whether or not they chose to volunteer or whether or not they were picked by Pyongyang and have been sent out regardless. But, these are soldiers that have not really seen combat properly, certainly not at this scale and intensity of the worst war in European history since the Second World War. And really the Korean Peninsula wasn't really in conflict since, 1951, 52. So it's highly unlikely these troops are going to make a massive difference. Ultimately, the Russians have been unable to push back Ukraine at a time when the Ukrainians have obviously been struggling with manpower and generally a disproportionate reduction in ammunitions and stuff. So yeah, it's a very complicated issue, but the main thing it has done is escalate between the bigger powers, if you want, US, Russia, in terms of their dealings and what we touched upon at the beginning of the podcast.
Now, I know we are getting towards the end of our time, but I did see you had an interesting interview on Kyiv Post where you talked about the civil unrest that's going on in Russia. And on top of that, we've been seeing news about Kadyrov and a Dagestani billionaire who's actually a member of the State Duma in Russia. They've been having issues, I guess, to say the least. Uh, does that have broader implications on the war? And can you just share a little bit more about the civil unrest?
Yeah, so the regional area I focused on in my masters was Russia. I do come from, well, half of my family comes from Siberia and Russia, so we've got I like to pretend that I've got a decent understanding of what's going on, but to be honest, it's very complicated to tell. Obviously, what information is available to us is what we can sort of piece together through, external reports and stuff. But to say that everything was hunky dory in Moscow and broader Russia would be a falsification of reality, right? It's not. Everything's not good, as they say. Of course, the Russian economy has been doing well. Russians are benefiting from a wartime economic boom. But the problem is that if you invest in military equipment, tanks, and stuff, that doesn't really trickle down and feed into the longer term supply side economic growth of Russia, right? It's a very specialized set of tech, which doesn't benefit the average individual very well. So Russians are reeling from it in certain ways. Inflation's at 21%. Potatoes are up, I think, 200% in terms of average cost. And you're going to be like, well, so what? It's a potato. But the point is that for rural Russians, these small things do begin to add up. We're never going to see, like, I don't think, a sort of Russians taking to the Kremlin and attacking Putin and sort of pulling him out of his office or kicking him out of a window or something. You know how that keeps happening, but it's certainly the biggest area where the war would change is from significant political and civil unrest within Russia, because the country just doesn't have the ability to manage that internally. That's why the attempted mutiny by the Wagner Group in June of 2023 was such a big deal, because it showed you that Putin was not able to keep a cap on everything all the time. And when it comes to things like Dagestan and Kadyrov, well, I mean, these are, billionaires and high-flying individuals who have egos and their own self-interests to keep. And that's why Putin's been so successful, because he's been able to keep a lid on all these other very powerful and sort of, prideful men, particularly, who want to be seen as having a role and influence in the direction of Russia. But he's purged people. He's, well, window smashes here, disappearances there. So, so I don't think well, I'll end with this last point, which is that keep in mind there are a few regional ethnic minorities like Dagestan and Chechnya where we've seen these tensions before, but ultimately the Russians respond in very heavy-handed ways. But what does happen is, well, attacks like you saw on March on the shopping precinct in Moscow, right? That was a big deal. And the Russians' direction to deal with it was one, initially ineptitude and sort of, what do we do? And then suddenly they get a lid on it. So Russia internally is a huge way that the war more broadly could direct, but it's something that is slow burning, and it would take probably a significant amount of the political elite, not just rural Russians, to really start standing up and making Putin uncomfortable. But then that leads to the question of who is responding to Putin, who replaces Putin, and how do we manage that in not just the West but anywhere, right? Because at least it's better the devil in the sense of Putin is a known entity, right? We know that he's not completely irrational and he's not just going to launch nukes at the West completely, but he is still a dictatorial strongman. So you get someone even worse in. You could have like the session of Peacemaker, right? That film with George Clooney and Nicole Kidman, where they're dealing with a sort of fragmented Russia of factions who get their hands on a nuclear warhead and they start doing all sorts of things. So very scary times, and especially as we see such a change in the US, and whether or not Trump can sort of somehow, force Putin to do something at a time when he is going to start seeing more economic challenges inevitably.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm sure the audience will enjoy it a lot, and we hope to have you again soon.
Yeah, it was amazing. Thank you so much. I hope everyone found it value. And as always, do keep a watch on Ukraine. It's a hot area and the place of geopolitics right now.